Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that introduces you to some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also incorporating their history, culture, and geopolitics. These next two episodes are going to be really important ones for this podcast. They're special edition episodes. So we're taking a little bit of a break from Asia, which we've been talking about my work in Asia for several weeks now. We're going to take a little bit of a break, and we're going to pivot to a special report on Ukraine that includes this episode and one that is upcoming that I'll describe to you in a moment. Why are we doing this? Because I think that it's important at this time, especially for you, the listeners and viewers, to understand the critical nature of the war in Ukraine, how it happened, why it happened, what the ramifications are for this war. So you're going to hear my perspective in this episode as someone who has first worked in Ukraine in the late 1990s and then later on after the full-scale invasion that occurred on February 24th, 2022. The next episode, you're going to hear from two very good friends of mine. One, Mayor Yuri Bova, the mayor of Trostianets, Ukraine, which is in the northeast part of the country, just 40 kilometers from the Russian border, and which was the first city to fall to the Russians during this invasion. It was occupied for more than a month before it was liberated by Ukrainian forces. You're going to hear a very poignant story from the mayor as to how he reacted and how his city reacted at the time of this invasion and the long lasting effect that it's had both on his city and on Ukraine. You'll also hear in that episode from the honorary consul of Ukraine in Indiana, Svetlana Ramer. Lana, as I call her, she used to work for me. And you will hear her perspective as a Ukrainian expatriate on this war and the impact that it's had both on the Ukrainians that are still in the country and those who live other places in the world. These are two episodes you are not going to want to miss. So let me just give you a preface right now. I first did some short-term projects in Ukraine in the late 1990s, and I fell in love with the country. It's such a large and diverse country. It is in the western part of the country. It is a lot of farmland. The beautiful drive in from Warsaw or Krakow, Poland to Kiev takes you through some very, very beautiful farmland. You can see why Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. In the southwest, it has mountains that are some of the most beautiful in the region. Of course, it has the port in Odessa on the Black Sea. And the western part of Poland, especially the city of Lviv, used to be part of Poland. So it's very Eastern European looking in its own way. But my favorite city in Ukraine, if I can say that I have a favorite, is Kiev, the capital. I fell in love with Kiev a long time ago, and when I went back for the first time after the full scale invasion, Kiev had certainly grown, but it still had that same charm that I always remembered from that, what I think is a world class city. What's different now than when I did projects in Ukraine in the late 1990s? Well, certainly there was a lot of modernization between that time and the time of the full scale invasion, but a huge event occurred in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity, when the Ukrainians threw off the yoke of their communist oppressor and installed a democratic government. This led to almost continuous war since 2014. A lot of you may believe that the full scale invasion that happened in February of 2022 was really the beginning of a war in Ukraine. That's not the case. Ukraine has been at war almost constantly, as I said, since 2014, since its Revolution of Dignity. And the blood that has been shed by Ukrainians during that period of time has left a profound influence on their psyche, but also has had a profound effect on Europe and the rest of the world. This podcast endeavors always to give both sides of the story. And those of you who have been listeners for a while know that some of the first projects I did in the international development business were in Russia. And I like very much the Russian people. I have a lot of friends who are Russian. Many fewer now than I did, regrettably. So I have experience in the Russian context. I have experience in the Ukrainian context. But I can tell you that to understand what's happening in Ukraine now, and really what's happened since the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, can only be fathomed if you realize what Vladimir Putin's end state is, what he's trying to accomplish. I've been asked this question a lot. What sense did this full-scale invasion make? Why did he do it? You hear a lot of different speculation, a lot of different answers. So let's default to his own words, to what he's said on many different occasions, in different ways and different configurations. But to paraphrase, it is a myth that Vladimir Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, he's been extremely critical of the Soviet leaders and how they ran the country. Vladimir Putin wants something that is potentially even scarier than a restoration of the Soviet Union. He talks in terms of restoring the Russian Empire. Now think about this. The Russian Empire included vast swaths of what is now Europe. This being the case, every single country that borders Russia, and even some of those that don't border Russia, must be on their guard all the time. Because if Putin's vision is to be carried out, it would absorb a significant part of what we know today as Europe. So, why is Putin doing this? Because he has a vision of restoring the grandeur of Russia. If you listen to my episodes on Russia, you know that when I first went there in the late 1990s, the country was devastated economically. They were flat on their backs. Literally, I was buying trinkets out of the trunk of people's car. We were pulling over on the side of the road at petrol trucks to get gasoline. The infrastructure was abhorrent. There were so many problems, social, economic, you name it. And the cloak had been pulled back from socialism. And let's just say that it was found wanting. Anybody who embraces socialism today should have been in Russia in the mid to late 1990s to see what all those years had produced for the people, which was poverty, authoritarianism, lack of governmental structure. And the more that I worked in Russia during that time, the more I kept hearing one theme. This is embarrassing. We can't tolerate this. We've been exposed to the world. One of my best friends in Russia, Marina, in Vladivostok, Russia, told me one night as we were having dinner, we need a strong man to take control and restore the honor of Russia. Think about that statement. To restore the honor of Russia. That's what Vladimir Putin has set out to do, is restore what he believes is the honor of Russia and the honor of its people. And in doing so, he has taken draconian measures in many ways to do that. Remember, this is a man who gassed his own people in a theater in Moscow when Chechen terrorists took over the theater and were trying to promote freedom for Chechnya, or an autonomous government in Chechnya. And they took hostages in the theater. Rather than negotiate, Putin gassed everyone in the theater, including his own people. There are no links that restrict Vladimir Putin from doing what he wants to do to restore the honor, what he perceives to be the honor of his country and his people. And that created the invasion of the Republic of Georgia, which Russia took upwards of 20% of the territory of Georgia in Abkhazia and Ossetia illegally, with no repercussions from the world other than a lot of hand-wringing and rhetoric from the United Nations and NATO. Then he began chipping away. The ongoing war in Ukraine, where in the Donbas, where he took Crimea, sovereign parts of a sovereign country. He rolled in, he took them, no repercussions from the world, outside of hand-wringing and some rhetoric by the United Nations, the EU, and NATO. This emboldened Putin to go further and further. And as Ukraine became, which is the largest country in Europe, as it began to move closer to the West, closer to becoming a candidate to join the European Union, closer to becoming a member of NATO, this flew in the face of Vladimir Putin's strategy. He knew that to unroll his strategy to restore the Russian Empire, he had to have the biggest chess piece on the board. He had to have Ukraine. not just pieces of it, like the Donbas and Crimea, but he needed to control Ukraine as a whole and install a government that was, at the very least, friendly to Russia and anti-West and anti-NATO. That is what led up to the full-scale invasion that occurred on February 24th, 2022. It was the act of a megalomaniac whose vision of the world is to restore a piece of history that will revitalize Russia. Unbelievably, however, it seems that Vladimir Putin and the Russians, who should have known Ukrainians very well, I mean, the Ukrainians are very close to the Russians. There are a lot of people in Ukraine, especially in the east, who speak Russian and who are Russian ethnicity. The Russians should have known that the Ukrainians would not lay down and just let the Russian army invade their country, that they would fight back. And yet it appears that either Vladimir Putin got bad advice or that he totally underestimated the Ukrainians, not just their military might, but the will of the Ukrainian people. As you'll hear from Yuri Bova, the mayor of Trostyanets, on our next episode, when he got the call at 5 a.m. Ukraine time on February 24th, 2022, that the Russians were invading, he was literally on the front lines. No one could believe it. They knew that the Russian troops were massing at the Russian border and that their surrogate forces of Belarus were amassing at the Belarusian border. But they believed that it was posturing until it actually happened. And I remember sitting at my computer in the Republic of Georgia, in Tbilisi, Georgia. Georgia, up until that time, was a strong and continues to be, from the standpoint of the people, strong advocates of Ukraine. I remember sitting there watching this unfold. By the time I got to my office in Tbilisi, the invasion was already underway. And I was getting reports from my friends there. And it defied imagination. Not only that the invasion was happening, but that Putin and the Russian army believed that they could take this country in 3 days. That's what he believed. He stated that. He believed that they would sweep through the country and take Kiev in 3 days and ensconce their person that's friendly to Russia in power, remove Vladimir Zelensky, the elected president, and put in place a surrogate, essentially as they have in Belarus. Well, we all know that didn't happen because the Ukrainians began to arm themselves. They were ready to defend their city. Weapons were passed out all over Kiev. People, civilians all over the city were sitting in their apartments with AK-47s ready to defend their city. And the fighting was brutal and hostile and Bucha and many of the suburbs of Kiev. I've been to Bucha, which is a main suburb in Kiev, and I saw firsthand, I laid a wreath at the memorial of those that were tortured and killed by the Russians during the time that Bucha was occupied during the siege of Kiev. The Russians showed no mercy, no empathy, no remorse. They violated every aspect of international law that you can violate, with torture, rape, murder. And this is not a report from CNN and Fox News. I've been on the ground. I talked to the people. I literally sat with people who were impacted by this. I've met women who were raped by Russian soldiers. I stood at the memorial for those who were killed in the genocide in Bucha. So I have witnessed this carnage myself. It was a horrifying situation. And yet, the Ukrainians held their ground. Kiev was not taken. The Zelensky government did not fall. And I think it was a turning point for Europe. And I remember sitting in my office in Tbilisi and watching the report from it was either the first or second night of the siege of Kiev. The Russians had surrounded the city. They had taken the airport in Hostomel. They were in Bucha, which is just a few kilometers from the center of Kiev. They were at the doorstep. And the Americans had actually offered a plane to Vladimir Zelensky to fly out of the country, to flee. What was his response? And I'll never forget this, him standing outside in the dark with some of the other leadership of the executive branch of government in Ukraine. And what were his words? I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. He was going to stay and fight. And that's what turned the tide in the siege of Kiev. The people galvanized. Even the opposition parties that had formerly been anti-Zelensky galvanized behind him. And they defended not only their city, but their country. And they drove the Russians not only out of Kiev, they drove them all the way back to the east of the country. And since that time, since February of 2022, till this day, in February of 2026, the Russians have made very little progress from the line in the east that they were pushed back to. Yes, they've taken, through brutal battles, areas such as Mariupol and others. They've controlled the Black Sea access. They've blown up and destroyed most of the energy infrastructure in the country. But they haven't been able to retake that ground. Many Ukrainian cities in the east have been liberated by the Ukrainian forces. And the Ukrainian forces have fought back ferociously, not only with manpower, but through technology with drones and missiles provided by the United States and Europe and others. Vladimir Putin wasn't expecting that. He wasn't expecting the second best army in the world, the Russian army, to become the second best army in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has not backed down. They've fought tooth and nail to defend their country. When I arrived there in February of 2023, almost a year after the full-scale invasion. The Russians had been driven from Kiev back to the east, but their tactic then became to harass and terrorize Ukrainians all around the country with the use of Shahad missiles provided by Iran, drones, attack drones, any other way that the Russians could use to terrorize the population. I spent many nights in that first trip in air raid shelters in Kiev. And yet when I came out of those shelters, what I saw were people going to work, people going to the cafe, people moving on with their lives. They weren't terrorized. They were angry. They weren't dehumanized. They were proud. They were wounded, but not defeated. And they remain so to this day. Between February of 2023 and June of 2025, I made more than a dozen trips to Ukraine of different lengths, a few months to a few weeks. I spent a lot of time in air raid shelters. I spent a lot of time with Ukrainians, talking to them about the effects of this war. And if you can see the rest of my office here, I'm surrounded by reminders of my time in the country during the full-scale invasion. Over to my right here hangs a Ukrainian battle flag that was signed by wounded Ukrainian soldiers in a hospital in Zolbuniv in the west part of the country. Wounded defending their country. Gruesome wounds. When I went to that hospital, all of the doctors greeted me. And most of these doctors were very young, right out of medical school. They had barely trained to be doctors, and all of a sudden were thrown into triage, having to amputate limbs and address horrible wounds caused by IEDs and others. And yet they were proud of that hospital. And I was proud because our project had provided a generator for that hospital that kept it running and kept the operating rooms and treatment rooms open even when the Russians blew up the entire energy infrastructure in the city. And I talked to the soldiers there. I talked to them about their experiences. And they gave me this flag that proudly hangs right here on my wall. I've talked to the mayors of municipalities around Ukraine about their experiences and coordinated all the support that we could muster for those municipalities. My friend Yuri Bova, who's going to join us on the next episode, the mayor of Trostyanets, presented me with this Hero of Trostyanets medal for our support of his city. But I'll tell you, that was a very kind gesture on his part. But I don't deserve a medal. Nobody who is not Ukrainian, who went there to help, but got to go back to their own safe and democratic country, deserves a medal. The Ukrainians are the heroes of this story, not people like me. What I can do is tell you my experiences and to tell you the story of what's really happening in Ukraine. Regrettably, the war in Ukraine, this full scale invasion, occurred because Vladimir Putin had been emboldened. When he took those baby steps in taking territory in the Republic of Georgia, in incursions into Donbas, taking Crimea, the UN did nothing but talk. The European Union did nothing but talk. European leaders were gridlocked. No one did anything. NATO, toothless, did nothing. And so he took the logical next step, and that is take the entire country. Except he didn't. And now, no one knows when this war is going to end. But when it does, I can tell you this: the Ukrainians will still be standing strong. They'll be bent but not broken. I know because I've been with them. I've sat with them. I know their mentality. I've walked the streets of Kiev with air raid sirens blowing. I've been in the bunkers with them. I've been in their hospitals and their schools where kindergarten-age children have to go to school behind sandbags for threat of missile attacks. Where a school recently in Kiev was hit by a Russian Shahad missile. And they had to go in, first responders had to go in and rescue kindergartners who witnessed firsthand the specter of war. I've been in Independence Square, Maidan Square in Kiev, to see all the flags of which each commemorates a fallen Ukrainian soldier. One Saturday morning, I went early. I walked early from my hotel to Maidan Square. And there was a young woman who was kneeling in front of the sea of flags. She carried a picture of her father and was praying for his spirit. Tears rolling down her cheeks. All I could do was stand and watch. I was in the military cathedral with some friends one night in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, not far from Europe, not far from the Polish border. In fact, it used to be part of Poland. We were in the church one night. I have a memorial to the fallen soldiers. This is where most of the military funerals for the Ukrainian soldiers killed in battle from Lviv are held. And over to the side, I saw a young woman, and it was very cold that night. It had been snowing, and there was no heat. And I saw a young woman in her mid to late 20s kneeling with a candle in her hand, praying. And I stood silently in the dark and I watched her. My friend Alexander was with me, and as we began to leave, this young lady began to leave as well, and Alexander stopped her outside of the cathedral and gave me the opportunity to talk with her. Her name was Alexandra, and she had lost her husband at the front. And she told me, I hadn't been very religious before. I hadn't really thought much about it. But I lost my husband a few months ago. And now every night I come and I pray, not only for him, but for those who are still fighting. This is a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, a young family, a young couple. They had everything ahead of them. And because of this senseless invasion perpetrated by a megalomaniac, her life's forever altered. I've been to the funeral of a Ukrainian hero who gave his life defending the country. I've walked down to the cathedrals in central Kiev, St. Sophia and others, and seen the pictures lining the walls of the cathedral. The pictures of lives that are gone. They've been taken. They've been erased because of a senseless series of wars since 2014, perpetrated by a rogue state. A rogue state, by the way, that I thought in the mid to late 1990s when I first went there had the potential to be a great country, a country that could add value to the world, but that spun out of control because of a man coming into power who had visions of restoring the Russian Empire. I look at those faces. I look at the flags in Maidan Square. I look at the burnout Russian tanks and Humvees that are displayed in the center of Kiev. I look at the banners that are calling for the release of the hostages, the prisoners of war from Mariupol, that the Russians still have to this day. And it brings tears to my eyes every time. There's no way it couldn't. It's shameful. It's ridiculous. It's senseless. Every negative word that you can come up with to describe something as futile as this really falls short. And I don't go on rants on this podcast. You know that. But I can't help myself today because I've got too many friends that are there. I was thinking earlier about a long stretch that a staff member and I spent in a air raid shelter in Kiev. I was surrounded by the employees from my company that work there on a daily basis. We were in the bunker together. And I expected them to be terrified, but they weren't. They did some work. We sang some songs. We ate some bread and cheese together. We laughed. We cried. We motivated each other. And hours later, when the air raid subsided, I walked out. It was dark by then, and snow had fallen, and it was still falling. And one of my favorite pictures that was taken of me in Ukraine is coming out of that bunker, standing in the snow. That snow meant something to me because it was like hope, it was like renewal. And coming out of that bunker after all of those missiles had been fired at Kiev, most shot down, some getting through, and watching the Ukrainians come out of that bunker, caring for each other and laughing and going about their business. I can't tell you what that did to me. And every time I look at that picture, I remember that night and I remember the feeling that I had in emerging from that bunker. I remember the feeling I had standing at that genocide memorial in Bucha and talking to the priest at the cathedral there who defied the Russians and who hid Ukrainians to keep them from being tortured and raped. I had a long conversation with him. He showed me the photos on his phone that he took of the carnage. I went to the hospitals, as I said before, and talked to the wounded. I went to the funerals. I walked through the memorials. And yet, even with all of that, and with all of the work that our company did and all the investment that we made on behalf of the United States government, my feeling is I did nothing compared to what the Ukrainians have done. So as you watch this episode and the next one, and I encourage you to watch them both because you'll never understand the next episode unless you understand the context that I've given you today. As you watch these episodes, I want you to hear this call of action that I'm giving you right now. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. But I call on European leaders to emerge from whatever fog you've been in for these last years since the full-scale invasion, and realize that what happens to Ukraine not only affects you, but should be of critical importance to you. And words are not enough. Money's not enough. Sanctions are not enough. If sanctions were enough, Putin would have already capitulated. They're not enough. The time for talking is over. The time for resolutions is over. The time for press conferences in Brussels is over. It's time to get ready to stop Vladimir Putin. I'll be honest, when the full-scale invasion happened, I was one of those people calling for NATO to intervene. I was one of those people calling for NATO to close the airspace in Ukraine, which if they had done that with the gains that the Ukrainians made on the ground, the Russians might have been defeated in the beginning. But they didn't. And as long as Russia controls the airspace, which they do, they can fire as many missiles and as many drones as they want with no repercussions to anyone except the Ukrainians who lose their lives when those missiles and drones blow up hospitals and churches and apartment buildings. Because if you think that they're focusing on military or infrastructure targets, you're wrong. Go to Kiev, go to Poltava, go to Trostinets, go to Kharkiv. You'll see how the Russians operate. So Europe needs to do something. beyond talking. The United Nations, the United Nations wouldn't even call this an invasion in the beginning. The United Nations was toothless, and they still are. They've done essentially nothing to support Ukraine except talk, which is, by the way, what the United Nations does best. The United States has supported Ukraine proportionally even more than the Europeans have. I was on the front lines of that. So I saw the kind of support the United States was providing, both militarily and to the civilian population. But even so, the United States is in the position to carry the most weight with Vladimir Putin to get him to stop this madness. He's not afraid of the Europeans. He's not afraid of NATO. But he is afraid of the United States. The United States can be the driving force in stopping this war and restoring the sovereignty of Ukraine. Stopping the war by giving Putin more land, by further emboldening him, and by basically saying, okay, you invaded a sovereign country, you committed war crimes, you violated international law, but to get you to stop, we'll give you territory. That's madness. It's ridiculous. It's not logical in any way, shape, or form. I love what my friend Dina in Ukraine said one time. She said, everybody's overcomplicating how to stop this war. It's very easy. Russians leave Ukraine. This is the same thing that Sanna Marin, the Prime Minister of Finland, said from the beginning. Not complicated. Russians leave Ukraine. That stops the war. Until the Russians leave Ukraine, Ukrainians are going to fight. This is what needs to happen. The Russians need to be motivated one way or the other. And you can draw any inference that you want to what the other is. But one way or the other, the Russians need to be motivated to leave Ukraine and to abandon this madness of restoring the Russian Empire. Those are just some quick thoughts to introduce this very special episode that's coming up on Ukraine. If you miss it, if you miss it on Monday, when February 23rd, when it airs, I hope that you will catch it later, because it will be one that will stay with you for a long time. So I hope that you'll join me for these special episodes and for every episode of Stops Along the Way, when we're going to explore countries that you may never travel to, but that you can see through the lens of my work there and the lens of those people I've met and experiences that I've had. Hope to see you at the next Some Stops Along the Way. Thank you for your attention. Have a great week.